next year, don't get COVID. Sorry. Anyway, and I just want to invite you to say some words for us.
Thank you, Roshi. Oh, I'm just pleased to be back again. I don't have a lot to say yet. I'll talk your ear off in a minute after Porter, but again, I'm just, my relationship to this place and the people here is just growing more and more fondly in my heart. So thank you again for having me.
All right, onward into.
And as everyone settles, I'll just invite Alonzo to one more time light the fire so that the teaching can open with the candle. You're welcome.
May we be blessed again with words of wisdom, words of our ancestors, knowledge that can provide a little bit of light and a little bit of direction in our lives. Thank you.
So it's a real honor to welcome you, at least virtually, Porter. Actually, I know you can see me in that direction. I'm looking at you here. But in any case, I'm going to ask Porter if you would introduce yourself because of, what you're doing in your community now around education is so inspiring. And then you'll jump into the history. Good grace, but it is such an honor. I wish you were my principal. Yeah. And Porter moved into an extraordinary role in his community. So if you could share a little bit about that before you begin to share about the history of your people. Thank you, Porter.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Porter Swentzell. I believe probably had the honor and privilege to join you all a good number of times now over the last, gosh, maybe like 7-8 years or something like that. And so it's good to be joining you all again, even though it's virtually. I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, so you might have to deal with me clearing my throat a little bit here and there, but otherwise I feel all right. As I said, my name's Porter Swentzell. I'm from Santa Clara, Pueblo, which is one of the 6 Tewa-speaking Pueblos here in northern New Mexico. As Roshi mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Capo Community School, which is our tribally controlled dual language school. That's a pre-K through 6th grade elementary at Santa Clara Pueblo. And I joined in 2022, so I'm almost at 2 years in serving in this role, is basically for all intensive purposes being the superintendent of this school. And I see some people maybe indicating they're having a harder time to hear me. Am I coming through clear? let me
Or you,
play with my microphone setting real quick. This might help. Maybe I turned up the microphone all the way up, so that probably would do the trick. So I know I've presented quite a few times at Upaya, and so I was a little bit, I feel a little bit weird about sharing kind of a similar presentation. So I kind of went and did some revamping to kind of focus a little bit on the impositions of colonialism within a context of now a little bit as an introduction to the area. And so without further ado, I'm gonna see if I can share here. Does that look right? Can you all see that? Uh, should be the introductory slide. There's some thumbs up.
can you hear me, Porter?
Yes,
Yeah, so we see the slide, but they're grayed out portions because there are things that are hovering over your
oh,
probably. So
right,
you can go and tell it to hide those things.
right. I think I've moved most of it out of the way. Does that look a little better?
Yeah, yeah, good.
Okay, all right, very good. So whenever I'm starting this, I just have to do my disclosures, which is that this is just one person's perspective um, so far to date, and based on things that I've learned over my lifetime, and so it's not authoritative in any way whatsoever. So it's just me, um, and my perspective, and I always have to give credit to the many teachers who taught me over the course of my lifetime, from the time that I was small all the way to this day, because we're all continuously learning. And so it's very important for me to give some credit to numerous people over the course of my life, and even going back further into time, those who came before us and who are now no longer with us, who have already passed on. But all of the different kinds of knowledges that they passed along to me, and continue to pass along to me to this day. And then, of course, really critical is in my position of talking about this subject is growing up here at Santa Clara Pueblo. That's our village today on the left hand side, and then on the right is how it looked uh, about 90 years ago now. And and so this is sort of the ground central of the village there, and the traditional center where we've been living at, or in the surrounding areas of it for about the last 400 or 500 years. And so that's still the sort of center of our community. And so those things influenced my perspective on giving this information, right? So those are kind of my disclaimers, and then of course getting into that word Pueblos. Who and what are Pueblos? So just to give a quick overview of that, I always like to break away from the traditional imaginary lines that we call state boundaries and international boundaries, because these much older sort of areas are really delineated by watersheds and mountains, and the flow of water across the landscape. And that's been the defining feature for human beings going back many millennia, right? And so this area that we think of as Pueblo country is really defined, and not exclusively to Polo people, but the places where our forebears have left their footprints going back thousands of years have been centered around these two major watersheds, the Colorado River and all its tributaries on the left side, and the Rio Grande and all its tributaries on the right side. And so it kind of, and I know it's hard to find a map that trespasses across international boundaries to really show these watersheds in their true shape. But this gives sort of an idea of these watersheds. You can also see that they are really strongly connected with what we call Mexico today. So there's been long relationships with our neighbors and our indigenous relatives to the south, and in a lot of ways, much more closer relationships with those individuals, those communities to the south, than even to our immediate neighbors on the Great Plains or what is today called the Great Plains and the Great Basin and those areas. So that's important to note. Now, what people generally refer to Pueblos today, these are all the black little dots on this map. And this is not a great map, but it does show the Four Corners region with New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Arizona. And all the little black dots are current day Pueblo communities, and it also includes the Hopi, the communities on the Hopi mesas in Arizona. What's left out on here is a Pueblo community that's located in modern day El Paso, and then also some of the unrecognized Pueblo communities like Tortugas Pueblo in southern New Mexico. So despite having that title of Pueblo talking about all the peoples, I always like to point out that there is a lot of language diversity between our communities. And so the language that we speak here at Santa Clara is the Tewa language, and that's the orange color. And the Tewa language is part of three different languages that are are what linguists call the Kiowa-Tanoan language family, and so that does include Kiowa, the Kiowa language, and includes Tiwa, Tewa, and Towa. So there's several languages that are all are related to each other. So you can see the green on the map, and which is Tiwa, and the blue color, bright blue, which is Towa, and then the orange flavor or orange color, which is I guess orange flavor too, which is the Tewa speaking villages, 6 of which are in northern New Mexico and 1 on First Mesa and Hopi. And so all these languages, they're related to each other, but they're related to each other like Romanian, Italian, and Portuguese, right? So that they're at one time share a common ancestral language, but today you can't really, they're not mutually intelligible. In addition to that, every single village has its own dialect. So even if they speak the same language as others, their dialect might make it a little bit more difficult for other speakers of the same language to understand each other. In the light purple color, you have Keres, which is spoken by 7 villages south of Santa Fe. And each one of these villages, again, like I said, has its own dialect. And then there's strong dialect differences between Eastern and Western, the circles of East and West. And then that language, Keres, is a language isolate, so not known to be related to any other language in the world. So there's no known relatives of that language, so unique in the whole world. The sort of darker or more purple color there, which is Zuni, which speaks the Zuni language. That language is also considered a language isolate, also not strongly linked with any other language spoken in the world, so only spoken by them. Now, on the left-hand side, you have the Hopi villages in Arizona on the mesas of Hopi, and those villages speak Hopi, which is related to a whole bunch of languages, which are part of the Uto-Aztecan language family, as linguists have labeled it. And so those are, the relatives in there are Pa-Yu and Yu and Shoshone and Raramuri and Aztec, of course, or Mexica, the language spoken by Mexica people in Mexico. So a large family, also not related to any of the groups of people on the right-hand side, right? In addition, it's been customary that every one of these communities has and continues to be independent of each other, even if they speak the same language. And so each of these are basically their own country. So, however, there is something that does kind of link us together, which is a shared culture in many ways. So, for example, um, being agriculturalists in the high desert environment has led to a certain worldview about the proper way to live in order to be successful as farmers in the high desert. And then, of course, living in sedentary villages that are really centered around mud architecture. So you can see an example there of a more recent bread oven being built. And sometimes it's masonry architecture, sometimes it's stone, and sometimes mud masonry, but mud is always the binding factor there. And so even though there's totally different languages, there's a lot of shared cultural aspects to all these communities. And in addition to that is a set of values and ideals that are really, even if people don't understand each other, are reflected again and again in the core values of Pueblo communities. And these are values that are passed along in the advice speeches of leaders, in the everyday instructions around the kitchen table, on and so forth. And I kind of put this list together by pulling there's quite a few Pueblo scholars who have focused on core values as a defining feature of our communities and at the core of who we are, as core values should be by their name. And so pulling these ideas together kind of from people from other villages besides my own village, a lot of different communities kind of fall into these categories of a strong emphasis on respect, but humility tied in with that as well. And so that's a defining characteristic. The idea of compassion and forgiveness as tied in with that. And each of the different languages have phrases or words that encapsulate these ideas as well. And as well as community. So serving one's community in a selfless fashion. So selflessness is very big. In fact, it, individuals are not really particularly looked upon fondly. So selflessness is very important. Responsibility and service is kind of tied in with that community and selflessness as well. That one should at the drop of a hat assist if called upon to serve in a way that basically surrenders up their life for the greater whole. And then, and these are all, you can see how they work together towards the same goal, is high emphasis on the perseverance of communities through the maintenance of traditions. And tied to that too is conformity. Um, I think that's probably something that a powerful characteristic that's is very highlighted in communities, right? And then of course, finally, generosity and sacrifice, which you can see is tied to others parts of this as well, is the desire and willingness to sacrifice without thought of oneself, right? And in service to the community. So these are widespread shared ideas between communities that might otherwise speak totally unrelated languages, right? So I want to also then to provide that context. I think history is very, very important, and so providing that quick history, I'm going to cover like I don't know, like 4,000 years real quickly in the next couple slides. But when we look at the story of Pueblo peoples, it really is tied into the emergence of agriculture, or what is scholars usually call the Neolithic Revolution, right? Um, and so that in particular, this one tropical plant called corn or maize, um, and that plant, which was a tropical grass growing in central Mexico. Um, its wild relative is known as teosinte. And that wild plant, sometime around 9 or 10,000 years ago, transformed into the early ancestor of what we call corn today or maize. And that process was with deep engagement with people living in that area. And as they entered into that relationship with that being called corn, it was transformative to their lives and changed who they were as people, right? And so you can see as people adopt corn agriculture, and I like to put it this way: as it spread out, there's a couple things that kind of made it take a long time. First off, it's a tropical grass, so it's not in any way the original corn maize was not in any way designed to grow, say, in what is today called New Mexico. It's a tropical grass, right? And so it needed to evolve and transform to be able to grow in this particular environment. But also, as corn was going along, moving, people weren't taking corn on as what we might think of someone maybe going to a feed store or to a nursery and buying seeds and being like, okay, which ecological zones does this seed fit into, and how many frost-free days is required for this plant to come to full fruition and things of that nature. As the plant is going, the way that it was transformative is that people say, okay, this is corn, maize. This is a sacred being. And if you're going to engage in a relationship with it, you have to basically give up your whole worldview and adopt an entirely new religion, right? And so you can see as corn spreads, not just northwards, but southwards, the incredible transformative impact of that. And you can see lots and lots of similar things wherever corn goes, right? So it's almost like a light bulb. As soon as people start growing corn, there's a bunch of other ideas that get adopted at the same time, right? And so I talk about the Neolithic revolution or the adoption of corn, not so much as the transition to agriculture, so much as a conversion, like a religious conversion, because that's what it was, a religious conversion to growing, to entering into the relationship with that being. So people are saying, that in order to grow this crop, you have to sing these songs, you have to see the world in this way, you have to believe in these things, and without that, you're not allowed to grow corn in essence, right? And so you can see that spreading. And so sometimes I joke around that people didn't domesticate corn, but corn domesticated people, right? So, and you can see it takes a long time for corn to reach what we call today the Southwest. And it takes a long time before people become full-time farmers because, as I was saying, it means you have to almost surrender your worldview and adopt a new worldview and adopt new practices and everything like that. And so it's about a couple thousand years of relationship building. But by about 1800 years ago, there's clusters of farmers in Arizona and what we call the Four Corners region today that adopt corn, and you can see that transformation happening in the form of architecture with the pit house architecture and these storage rooms on the north side of the pit house. The floor plans on this right hand side with these circles are like storage cysts or rooms on the side. Fairly basic. However, the adoption of this architecture almost 2,000 years ago is so profoundly transformative. You engage in that relationship with corn, you start building these buildings. This same layout of the building persists all the way to this day. So I will say again, this building architecture floor plan persists in some form from 1800 years ago all the way to this day and is still relevant in our communities to this day. So that's kind of the impact, and it goes to those core values, as I said, that a reliance, and you can see those core values stretching back into the depths of time, right? An insistence on conformity, about perseverance and traditions and culture, right? It doesn't mean that things don't change, but also that things change very slowly, and so that things that are thousands of years old are still what we do today, right? So starting about 1,300 years ago, those pit house structures on the south side of little clusters of habitations that with the storage sys on the north side, those start to turn into rooms, and you start to get basically the same layout spread over a wide area, which is one or two or three pit houses and a cluster of rooms on the north side. And this style of building is what archaeologists creatively call Pueblo 1. And so they also have Pueblo 2, Pueblo 3, and Pueblo 4. And so those are kind of tracking the labels that archaeologists apply to track that evolution over time, right? And then something happens about a little over 1,000 years ago, which is in a dry wash in what is today northwestern New Mexico. There was this fluorescence of major stone architecture that started to take place. That was also a very transformative time, right? So there's about a couple hundred years, or several hundred years, that where you have, and this is longer than the entire existence of the United States, you have a whole series of massive villages constructed that are aligned with solar occurrences, so like the equinoxes and solstices, but in a rare twist that is very unusual among cultures all around the world. Many of the buildings are also aligned with lunar activity. So the moon moves along the horizon in a similar way as the sun does, right? But it takes much, much, much longer than the sun. And so you have to, I can't remember the exact number of years, but it's like 14 years for the moon to make its circuit. So in order to align your buildings to the moon, you have to wait around for, 14 years at a time to make sure things are lined up. So this was a time period of where a lot of architectural styles started to kick in that were much more multi-story masonry kind of architecture. And then starting about in the 1100s, I got the date wrong up there, that people moved away from Chaco as a way of life and moved into the Four Corners area. And this is the area that most people, if they know anything about this time period, are maybe familiar to Mesa Verde. And maybe many of you have even visited Mesa Verde. This is kind of like the postcard version of Mesa Verde Cliff Palace, as it's called. But this is just one of a multitude of communities in the Four Corners area. And so for about 150 years, there was a big explosion of population in the Four Corners area. But just as quickly as people had moved out of the Chaco Wash region into the Four Corners Mesa Verde region, starting in the 1270s, going into the first part of the 1300s, people empty out of that area and move down to the current day villages where we live today. So by the time that the Spanish invade what is today New Mexico and Arizona, there was maybe about 100 or 120 villages across that sort of blue area, right? And so and it's not very mysterious. The oral traditions of Pueblo people are our oral traditions are place-based. So they describe the villages that we lived at prior to the village that we lived at today. It's not engaged in tracking chronological time, but it's looking at place-based. So the village that we lived at before this or before that, going back. And they track back to these areas, these ancestral places in the Mesa Verde and Four Corners region. Now, when people move down into the Rio Grande or into our current areas, there's a period of several hundred years or so where larger and larger villages, perhaps larger than even any of the famous ones at Mesa Verde, definitely larger than those, and even Chaco Canyon, many of the villages in the Rio Grande and its tributaries grow. And this is just one example of Pecos Pueblo multi-story villages oftentimes centered around a main central plaza area, just as you see here. And many times that's rectangular or square shaped. There's a good number of villages that have kind of almost like a street layout with a series of parallel streets, but large communities, and people centered on those communities. This is the world that the Spanish came into in the 1500s, was these multitude of large Pueblo communities, each one their own country, each one speaking their own dialect and their own dialect of one of those languages, and even some of the languages that are extinct now, like Puro and Tampuro and Humanas. Now, switching to the Spanish invasion, I always like to highlight a few things, which is to talk about it in terms of impositions, because we have to change the narrative around to being, okay, before Europeans, there was no history. After Europeans, there's history. But no, we've always been seeking ways to survive and thrive in this environment, right? In this place that we call home. And so colonialism introduced a series of impositions, and some of them very serious impositions, and continue to be impositions. Um, but that hasn't ever stopped us from our continuing journey of maintaining who we are as Pueblo people, right? Um, and I always like to point this out because there was a famed Australian scholar, Patrick Wolf, in his seminal article, Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native, stated that settler colonizers come to stay. Invasion is a structure, not an event. So sometimes people think of that word colonialism or colonization as it happened in 1598 or it happened in 1620 or whatever the case might be. But to think about it as, no, it is a structure, an ongoing process, and not just something that happened, right? And so within that context, I think it's very important to also note that Pueblo peoples, we have unfailingly and relentlessly asserted our agency as autonomous nations. So that's something that histories usually tend to focus on particular perspectives of the past. And so, and those perspectives oftentimes take away the agency of people, that the colonized were not actively engaged in remaining who they were at every step of the way. And it's important to note that as well. And engaging with the colonial structures in a way that would continuously seek to assert agency, right? So I like to put those two as kind of the prelude to that. Now, it's also really famous to talk about the Spanish invasions and the revolts of the 1600s, 1500s, 1600s, going into 1700s. And just to kind of highlight some of the key dates on there, I'm not going to go through all of that because it tends to kind of get lost in a number of things. But there's a couple of things to note is that the Spanish, when they came, they came initially looking for riches in what is today the Southwest, and not finding those riches. In 1540, they decided to leave what they called at that time La Tierra Nueva, and so and Coronado went broke looking for this sort of these riches, right? And so the Spanish said, okay, that's coming to New Mexico is not worth anybody's trouble. So we'll just forget about it for about 50 years. So it's not for another couple generations where the Spanish come back to set up shop permanently. And the primary reason behind that, well, initially there's a thought that maybe some kind of revenues or riches could still be achieved. When that becomes not possible, then the friars who accompany the Spanish are the ones who say, oh, we have to stay to save the souls. And so that's where the sort of main side of the Spanish colonization comes in. And within the first 20 some years, they have built 60 massive mission complexes across New Mexico, and some of these are enormous complexes with lots of stone architecture and things of that nature. And so very quickly it becomes a strong tension. Remember, we go back to those core values about perseverance of who we are, right? And obviously there's parts of this new worldview that are in alignment with those core values, but there's also parts of it that contrast with that worldview. And there's friction that arises from that, right? And so you can see that there's conflict all along the way throughout those first 100 years. And the most famous in 1680 when most of the pueblos joined together and actually eject all the colonial um, forces from New Mexico for about 12 years. But during this whole time period, there's about over 108-year period of the first 108 years of the Spanish colonial empire in New Mexico. There's about a 90% decline in Pueblo population. So it's hard to put that into to really take into full consideration what that would mean for any kind of society around the world to lose 90% of your people. It's a catastrophic demographic collapse. And yet the maintenance of those values over time is really critical to continuing on who we were and repeating and reproducing our culture through that time of incredible imposition. Um, but the other side of it too is that I always like to talk about colonialism as similar to Baskin Robbins, right? There's 31 flavors of Baskin Robbins. Well, there's like 31 flavors of colonialism, and they're each a little bit different. They're all ice cream or cold sweet desserts, but they're all different flavors. Some of them have nuts, some of them don't, right? Some of them are different colors. Well, colonialism kind of works like that too. And so Spanish colonialism is very distinctive, and in some strange ways, it allowed us to persist and hold on to our homelands in ways that people who were impacted by other forms of colonialism were not, right? And so that doesn't necessarily mean that it's better, it's just different and allowed different things to come out of that experience, right? And so the first thing to keep in mind is that the Spanish, all the way up till the 1800s, had basically for all practical purposes a feudal economic system. So after there wasn't immediate riches to be found, they saw that the wealth was in the people themselves, right? Whether it's for the missions purposes or for the collecting of tribute as basically feudal estates, what are better known as encomiendas. And so Polo communities were basically the Spanish in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases say live in your same community where you're at, and we'll give you lands and protect your area. Well, there'll be a church there. You have to convert, but also we're here to collect tribute, and that's the main purpose behind what we're up to, because that's the basis of the economic system, right? And so through that feudal system, the Spanish dictated that every one of our communities would receive a grant of land that is 4 square leagues, and 1 league being about 5,000 varas, which is roughly equivalent of a Spanish yard. And so they would measure from the churchyard, the cross in the front of the church, and 1 league in each direction of the cardinal directions from that cross. And from that, no non-Pueblo people were allowed to bring their sheep into that area, grow crops in that area. They had absolute water rights and had a lot of authority over that area to control it. And so, and that vara is the same length as canes of office that the Spanish brought. So the Spanish brought these canes of office, which they distributed to each of our Pueblo communities, and these canes were used to measure out our lands, which is approximately about 17,280 acres. And so these weren't written down on paper, but it was just understood that these are the facts. Every village has 4 square leagues, And what would happen is if someone needs to find out whether the lands were properly, where the land actually ended, is that they would get ropes, and you can see a picture here, and they would measure out the ropes in like 50 vara lengths. So they would use the cane of office to measure it out, and then they would stretch the rope until they reached 5,000 varas in each direction and pile up some rocks. And that was how the land, there wasn't a paper trail, right? And so, but in a way that protected set and solid area around each village. In addition, oftentimes Pueblo communities added to their land through purchases or letters of grant. And so this created a system of land that was unique from the rest of the United States. In addition, I mentioned the canes of office that the Spanish brought. The part of the reason why the Spanish called us pueblos is because in their whole empire, they kind of categorized indigenous peoples into two groups, which is Indios Bárbaros and Indios de los Pueblos. Basically, if you are a farmer that lived in a kind of sedentary or semi-sedentary village, then you were an Indio de los Pueblos, or village or nation Indians, right? And those that weren't farmers, that were nomadic, semi-nomadic, Indios Barbaros, and you can think about the word and figure out what that translates to. But when the Spanish came, and they did this not just in New Mexico, but all over. You can see this in Mexico and Guatemala, El Salvador, Peru, Ecuador, all over the place, right? So there's indigenous peoples. They said each one of you has to have a government that we can engage in, right? They're not really paying too much attention to our traditional form of governance, right? And that there will be a governor, a lieutenant governor, a sheriff, and various other officials, and they will carry that vara, which will be the measure of your lands and the symbol of your authority. In many cases, they have the stamp of the crown on top saying, you're direct vassals of the King of Spain, and so no one can mess with you or your lands, right? And so over time, that system became integrated into Pueblo communities, so that these, and most of the Pueblo communities use their traditional form of governance and basically utilize this Spanish form of government to assert agency. And it's something that persists with us to this day, right? So you can see from a couple of years ago at Santa Clara, our tribal officials for that year, and some of the officials are carrying their vara or their cane, showing their authority. And so that's a system of government that we adopted several for 300 and so years ago, and continues to this day. For most of our Pueblo communities, those individuals are appointed on an annual basis, but sometimes on a semi-annual basis, and they have to drop everything in their life for that year and go to serve their community in whatever role that they've been designated to. So that's something where we took a Spanish system and then integrated it with our traditional government system and then utilized it to perpetuate who we are as Pueblo people, right? And another one is actually related to the imposition of Catholicism in our communities. And that imposition had violent stretches, especially in the 1600s. Now, in the 1700s, the Spanish ran out of money, and that's a whole nother story I won't get into. But with the Bourbon reforms, the church kind of was left to rot in many places, and especially in New Mexico. And so we incorporated Catholicism into our communities in the New Mexico Pueblos, and merged it with our own cultural calendar. And so utilizing the saint feast days to celebrate the things that would normally be celebrated at that time anyway, right? And so in addition to a myriad of other days as well, right? And so when the Spanish came, of course, first thing they would do is they would say this is a church and build a church there, or designate what the patron saint of the village. So of course, like my village, my mom's village, Pueblo de Santa Clara, is saying, okay, this is the village of St. Clair. And these are the priests that came with the Spanish. and this is true all over the place, is that they divided up territory by different orders. So the order that was in New Mexico was the Franciscans, and so they always named villages after their favorite saints, just as like everywhere that was always the case. So Saint Clair was an early Franciscan follower of Saint Francis, and so you can see that in the naming, right? And so these throughout the year, every village has their main saint day, but they may have other saint days that they celebrate as well. Uh, maybe dozens of them that they celebrate along with the calendar. And the one that's coming up right now on June 13th is Saint Anthony San Antonio. So we're going to be getting ready for that here a matter of days. And this is kind of the thing where we celebrate the saint by practicing our traditional culture. And so again, you can see the imposition of colonialism, but the maintenance of agency in Pueblo communities to continue who we are, making sure that our core values continue, and also in many ways transforming the church to not only fit our cultural calendar, but actually, in many cases, transforming it to actually reinforce those core values in profound ways, right? So the ultimate irony is that the the church itself was ultimately weaponized against the colonial invaders, right? So the church becomes a primary anti-colonial weapon, which remains a thorn in colonial structures afterwards and to this day. So these are some of the sort of elements of that legacy of Spanish colonialism. Now, almost 200 years ago, there was a new set of invaders, the Americans, who invaded during the Mexican-American War, and they brought an entirely different flavor of colonialism. And in a lot of ways, and I would argue a much more destructive form of colonialism, because and you can see it in the rest of the United States where peoples were removed entirely from their homelands and things of that nature. And that was the American flavor of colonialism. Um, and so the Americans invade. They in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, they have a instructions in that treaty or as part of the treaty saying all citizens of Mexico their lands will be recognized within the new United States territory boundaries, right? Unwittingly, the Americans had failed to notice that Indians in Mexico were actually citizens of Mexico. And so when they wrote it into the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, they inadvertently recognized our lands as they were under the Spanish rule of the Four Square Leagues. And so the Americans initially set out to recognize those lands, but they also were looking for paperwork. And remember, there was no paperwork, and so these fake grants were developed by different sort of criminal elements that actually ended up being the lands that we received patents from the federal government, and that we received them in 1863. And Abraham Lincoln sent the patent to each village, almost all of them, not all of them, along with a cane engraved with his signature. And so that was a recognition of our sovereignty. But then the Americans immediately began to think about how can we deprive indigenous peoples of their lands, because that's a primary feature of American colonialism, right? And so there was this famous Supreme Court case, United States v. Joseph in 1876. And part of this is the language in there saying, actually, Pueblo people are not Indians because they're Indians only in feature, complexion, and a few of their habits, in all other respects superior to all but a few of the civilized Indian tribes of the country and the equal of the most civilized thereof. And since basically they're saying Pueblo people are too civilized to be categorized as Indians, and therefore we can figure out ways to buy their land or dispossess them of their land through that process, right? So classic American colonialism. Now, the other thing that they brought in addition to that, saying, well, they're not really Indians, but they are in complexion, as they said, in features. So the Americans developed the Indian industrial school system in the late 1870s and going over the next several decades after that. And some of the earliest ones were here in New Mexico, the Albuquerque Indian Industrial School, Santa Fe Indian School, St. Catherine's Indian School. There's one in Phoenix, a whole slew of these industrial schools. They're basically set up as military schools. And their founder, Captain Henry Pratt, is known for his statement that the schools are designed to kill the Indian and save the man. So they were to strip away culture and language and everything like that and transform Native children into model American citizens, right? And that had serious implications. You know, right now the federal government had just issued out, the Department of Interior issued out a report of findings of abuse um, and children dying in these boarding schools to kind of match what was the research done in Canada, which is probably much, you know, a lot more people are dying in those schools in Canada. But looking at reconciliation and things of that nature. In some ways, these schools had not as big of an impact as might be thought, but that was also a key feature of the federal or the United States colonial project, right? Um, Now, fast forward to 1913, and New Mexico is trying to become a state in the United States. Um, and there's still the issue that there's all these Pueblo communities, their kids go to Indian schools, but based on United States v. Joseph, they're considered to be too civilized to be Indians. So the United States says, hey, New Mexico, you need to solve your Indian problem because what are Pueblo people, right? And so the new definition came out of United States v. Sandoval. And you can see the main opinion from Justice Van Deventer at that time said, the people of the Pueblos, although sedentary and disposed of peace and industry, are nevertheless Indians of race, customs, and domestic government, always living in separate and isolated communities, adhering to primitive modes of life, influenced by superstition and fetishism, chiefly governed according to crude customs inherited from ancestors, essentially a simple, uninformed, and inferior people, therefore Indians, right? And so this is the language of the United States in thinking about how to engage with Pueblo peoples, right? Say, okay, well, they are Indians, but in the meantime, between 1876 and 1913, thousands of people had moved onto Pueblo lands and had dispossessed Pueblo people of their lands within their square leagues, right? And so this created a lot of issues. The other side of this too is in this time period, the discipline, the academic discipline of anthropology was kind of just coming to be, and a lot of its existence came out of Pueblo community. So a lot of the grandmothers and grandfathers of the school of anthropology, the discipline of anthropology, got their start in Pueblo communities, and so these are just some of the really famous giants in anthropology. They all came in during the late 1800s, early 1900s, and came in and basically digging into Pueblo communities to find out everything they could about Pueblo communities before they went extinct, as they thought that they would. And so it's a different kind of extraction and a different kind of colonial imposition, because a lot of our communities to this day, a lot of things that we do are intensely private to our communities, and these individuals were digging into that private aspect of our communities. And so, and they were making their academic career off of basically taking things that they weren't supposed to know about and publishing them and sharing them, right? But this also led then to the glorification of Pueblo people in a lot of ways, which is through tourism. Even the entire practice of tourism, in many ways, as we know it today, was also invented from visiting Pueblo communities, right? So it could be a key source for anthropology and then also for tourism. The Fred Harvey Company developed many of the key features of tourism through bringing tourists to Pueblo communities to consume Pueblo culture before it vanished, right? And that introduction of cash economy and tourism was transformative to arts and lifeways and things of that nature. And you can see some of the old pictures there. And so these kind of combination of things also led to what might call yearners, which are basically people who came into Pueblo communities and became sort of infatuated with Pueblo peoples and started to copy lifestyles or uh, use Pueblo people as a prop to develop their own ideas. You know, you can see some anthropologists in there too that kind of became enamored with Pueblo peoples and start to mimic. Others like Carl Jung, part of his psychoanalyst basis of his psychoanalyst theories came from a visit at Taos Pueblo. You have wealthy heiresses like Mabel Dodge Lujan building faux adobe like houses and setting up teepees in their yard to have Taos Polo men go and sing in the yard for the benefit of visitors and things of that nature, right? And that set a pattern that is still prevalent to today of people extracting or mimicking Pueblo concepts. And one that's very obvious in New Mexico is the state flag. The state flag is a symbol that originally was very much tied to Zia Pueblo originally. That's why they call it Zia symbol. So the symbol was copied and utilized for the state flag itself, right? So appropriating images of other peoples and cultures um, through kind of yearning for something else, right? And then you can see some particularly egregious examples where people who had read anthropological texts then created their own sort of civic clubs where they would copy Pueblo dances and traditions. You can see what the so-called Smoky tribe located in Prescott, Arizona, who among their members, you know, this was kind of like the Elks or the Rotary Club kind of thing, but instead their thing was to dress up like Pueblo people and do Pueblo dances. And so they of course had some pretty important people as part of their club, including Barry Goldwater, in copying Pueblo culture and things of that nature. And even all the way to this day, you have a number of Boy Scout groups, especially 232, located in Colorado, that has their whole sort of center for their activities that's modeled after a Pueblo ceremonial room, and they copy Pueblo dances and songs. And so it's something that's very, very offensive, but it's also the appropriation that comes out of that time period. So that's a different kind of imposition and extraction of settler colonialism, that not just seeking land and the wealth and of peoples, but even their culture itself becomes something that can be appropriated and used um, outside of its context, right? At the same time that these kind of things are going on, though, you have what's called the Indian dance controversy, where you have a number of Protestant missionaries going around. Some of them visited some of the Pueblo communities during the annual feast days and were horrified at what they saw when they saw our traditional dances. And they combined together to create something called Circular Number 1665, which was special instructions created by the Protestant missionaries for superintendents of Indian affairs to regulate tribes by not allowing dances except on during weekdays, only once a month, and nobody under the age of 50. These were the recommendations. And in some communities, this was enforced pretty strongly. Unfortunately, the places where it was most enforced were not in Pueblo community. I guess unfortunately, it came from Pueblo communities in the sense that missionaries saw our traditions, but they mostly enforced it in non-Pueblo communities. So many other communities across the United States were impacted by Circular 1665. So there's an enamoration with culture, but then at the same time, the prohibition of it, right? And continuing legislation will work to take away lands And a famous example of that, the Bursum Bill of 1922, which would have stripped our communities of 60,000 acres by allowing all the squatters that had come onto our lands to just basically just keep the lands that they had squatted on. And this really united all the Pueblo governors together and Pueblo communities to fight against this bill. And they were successful in defeating this bill. It never was passed. And then this caused the, where is it at? I guess okay, sorry. And it caused the passing of the 1924 Pueblo Lands um, Act, which basically created a mechanism to sort of sort out some of those issues. However, many acres are still out of Pueblo hands. So, for a good example, is that Santa Clara, basically the entire town of Espanola is on Santa Clara Pueblo lands. And so that whole town is, for all intensive purposes, within our 4 square leagues and definitely within our traditional boundaries. And so we're still working every day to try to reclaim and in many cases buy back land that was supposed to originally be ours in the first place, right? So this is an ongoing challenge as well. Um, Now, one of the big sort of watershed moments in 1928 was when a review of those Indian boarding schools was done and found that they were deeply problematic, and they weren't fulfilling their goal of assimilation or much of anything except maybe just causing harm, right? And so this report was promoted by an individual who actually got started by visiting Taos Pueblo, John Collier, and had worked on the Bursum Bill, defeating the Bursum Bill. And because of his promotion of this work on the Marion Report and recognizing the problems of the boarding school issues in the United States, he was set as the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And this ushered in a very, very important time period for all tribes, but especially Pueblo communities as well, which is a shift of policy from assimilation towards looking at perhaps preserving traditional culture, stopping something called allotment, which was something that didn't impact Pueblo communities, created Indian hiring preference, reformed the boarding schools, and started the day school system, which is very important to the work I do right now because I work at an old Indian day school, which is now tribally controlled. So this was a big shift in government policy, right? But just as things shift this way and that way, it's kind of like a pendulum, right? And one of the important things that he did as well is introduce the Indian Reorganization Act, which kind of issued out constitutions to tribal nations, cookie cutter constitutions for those nations to adopt so that they would be governed independent of Indian superintendents. It primarily did not impact Pueblo communities because we had this old form of governance that was still very active, but a few of the Pueblos had by the 1930s or even later ended up getting into a situation where they did adopt the Constitution. And so that was very transformative at that time. And Santa Clara was one of those communities that adopted a Constitution, but very, very transformative to a lot of Native communities. The other thing that, because of his relationship with Pueblo communities and defeating the Bursum Bill and protecting Pueblo lands or assisting with that, that you have when the Selective Service Act is started in 1940, you have an almost 100% response rate of Pueblo men, especially in New Mexico. And so when World War II rolls around, almost 100%, if you have 100% participation, then you're going to get a lot more people involved. And so more Pueblo men and more Pueblo people served in World War II than any other ethnicity in the United States. So that was a very, very these young individuals who probably never had left their community. Now they were going off to Europe or to the Pacific, going to factories in Chicago and Seattle, shipyards. And so this was a very, very, World War II is one of those moments that was very, very, very transformative in modern time, right? When those individuals came back, they were hit with the policies of termination and relocation, which the termination part didn't really impact whole communities, but this opened up opportunities for people to move, take advantage of special training opportunities and job placement opportunities in cities all around the United States. And so many of, especially the World War II veterans coming back, took advantage of those opportunities and moved to Los Angeles, to Chicago, to all over the place to work in manufacturing or other kinds of things, right? So you can see the impact. This is, I know it's that time of afternoon that it's not good to throw up spreadsheets, but you can see in 1964 that there's all the pueblos on the left side there, their tribal memberships, and how many people were living there. So before World War II, you have the vast, vast, vast majority of people living within their community. But by 1964, as a result of these policies, you have some communities where there are, you can see Nambe at 59, Sandia at 58%, a lot of them in the 60s and 70s, some in the 80s. Some still, almost everybody still live there. Like Santo Domingo, you can see 98% still residents, but that there's a lot of people that were now moving away from their communities. So a major impact on Pueblo communities and the continuance of language and things of that nature. Combine this with the passing of the Housing and Urban Development Act in 1968, which brought in HUD homes into Pueblo communities. And you can see a floor plan of one there, pretty typical kind of floor plan, which have a totally different layout than a traditional floor plan of Pueblo homes. You can see that on the right-hand side, the traditional floor plan there, where you have not separate bedrooms and things like that, but a couple of storage rooms, a general living room, a grinding room, and an outside work area with an oven, right? So you have a very different layout where people are kind of all together, extended families living there. And then the HUD home promotes the idea of a nuclear family with separate bedrooms and things like that. And you can link the adoption of HUD homes directly to increase domestic violence. It's totally linked with language loss because these buildings, the new buildings, had electricity and things of that nature, right? Reduction in knowledge about architecture and how to build your own homes. So it's a very a large assault on Pueblo communities, and you can see in some of the communities when those HUD homes are brought in, a huge number of people moved out of the traditional village center into these suburban style tracts of housing. And so it's a big sort of ongoing impact on Pueblo communities from that time. At the same time, the federal government passed something that's very important is the time period that we're in now, which is the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975, which was supposed to be sort of a way to allow tribes to govern themselves in more ways, right? So basically say, okay, we're going to give you the money that we would have used to run programs in your community, and you get to run them yourself, right? So so not all our tribes took advantage of that, but most of them today use different parts of their programs are self-governance programs, right? And so it's take over education. So my school, for example, Japo Community School, and the reason why we control it is because of this 1975 act where the federal government said it was run as basically a federal school, just the same as like the Department of Defense or anything else, right? They said, okay, we will give you the money that we would have used to run the school ourselves, but now you're in charge of doing it. However, speaking from experience, there are tons of strings attached to those monies, right? And I'll get into a little bit of that later as well, right? One of the things also with that sort of increasing, you have housing coming in with electricity, and then the need to pay bills, get more engaged with wage economy, and then even when you look at the taking over of tribal government programs and the employment of people into that cash economy, you can also see a major reduction in farming from 1938 to 1981. And some of these are probably funky in different ways, but a lot of them you can see are major negative numbers. At the bottom, you can see a total which is about a third decline up till from 1938 to 1964, with continuing decline that you can see from those numbers that are in 1981. And so this is something that also was impactful. Think about the center of who we are as farmers in the high desert environment, right? Those are some of the transformative elements that come from the impositions of colonialism within the United States context, right? And some other any of you that have driven up to Opaya or gone just about anywhere in New Mexico would be hard pressed not to notice the establishment of gaming um, organizations, right, which was started in 1988 and was also transformative in both positive and negative ways. And then something that also at first glance looks like a very positive thing, which was NAGPRA 1990, allow the return of funerary items or items of cultural patrimony to descendant people. And so this allowed what archaeologists have dug up lots of human remains, or anthropologists have taken off with items of cultural meaning from Pueblo communities and other communities as well. This allowed for those items to be returned back. However, there's a couple of different things that are very important, which is that it only applies to federal lands, and it only applies to federally recognized tribes. And it creates basically a consultation process where tribes then have to prove that those items belong to them, right? So you can see a number of areas where you run into a lot of problems with that. And so in some ways, you end up pitting tribes against each other to get back their relatives, right? Just to have them reinterred and taken off of a shelf in a museum somewhere, right? However, if it's a private institution or private property, this does not apply to anything there. So you have landowners who actively just are desecrating graves, digging up old villages, right? And the law doesn't apply to them at all, right? So I kind of want to end up where I've gone through a lot of different sort of examples of the imposition of colonialism, but to go to my current day job, and before you start reading the text there, because there's a lot of jargon there, I want to just draw your attention to the image there, which was passed on to me from one of my great aunts, who had it passed on to her from one of her older relatives as well, which had been a shoebox full of documents. And they came from over 100 years ago, 130 years ago now. And one of the many of them come from one of our relatives, my great grandpa, who's listed on here. And he was governor in the 1890s of Santa Clara. And so in there is a bunch of his correspondence, mostly written all in Spanish, with the local regional Office of Indian Affairs official, like the superintendent of the region. But one of the things that they decided to save in that shoebox was this document right here, which, and it's a little bit hard to read in that old script, but it's dated 1894. And it's to certify that reposing trust in the integrity, sobriety, intelligence, and discretion of Felix Velarde, who's our great grandpa, and in recognition of his progress in the ways of civilized life, I do hereby appoint him a visitor. And the rest is cut off at the bottom, but he's a visitor to our day school, our school here at the Pueblo, the place where I work now, you know? And it kind of hit me in the stomach to think, wow, 130 years ago, our governor of our village, who's like the father of all the people for that year that he's in service, right? He had to get a special permission slip from the superintendent of Indian Affairs, so that certified him that he was a person of integrity, sobriety, intelligence, and progressed in the ways of civilized life to even visit his own kids at the school, right? And thinking, wow, that's unbelievable, right? But now in my current role, I'm from Santa Clara Pueblo. All of my leadership team at the school, we're all from Santa Clara Pueblo. So thinking in hindsight, wow, so much has changed where all the leaders of the school, all the directors and myself, we're all from this village, right? And it's our school and so on and so forth, right? And that's a big change. And got to celebrate that change. However, go back to how the federal government ties strings to things, right? And so, a good example of ongoing settler colonialism, right, is that the BIE requires these intense background checks, which I don't disagree with schools needing background checks. You should probably do that, but it requires they have special laws just for Indians, the Indian Child Protection Family Prevention, and its related implementing regulations, all on their Crime Control Act, right? Says anybody that steps foot on the school for 3 or more days, they have to be subjected to FBI fingerprint check, this huge background check, and then they have to be adjudicated before they can be allowed on campus, right? So then it struck me all of a sudden to think, wait a second, this document on the left-hand side seems so old-fashioned. However, they still have that same system in place. They're saying, yes, you can run your own school, but we don't trust you enough to hire the people to look after your own kids. So take that in for a second. We don't trust that you would make good decisions about your own children that work at your school that you run, right? And how does that speak to how things have changed, but also in a big way, how much hasn't changed, right? And so how do these federal standards continue to perpetuate those colonial policies? And thinking about, is this even serving the purpose that they're intended for? Or are they simply that imposition that ultimately doesn't allow us to hold educational sovereignty for our own community school? So these are the kinds of battles that I fight on an everyday basis. So I think of all those that came before, right? And those that are coming after us, right? And we're just part of that long story of who we are as Pueblo people, right? And that our forebears, those that came before, they also faced many, many challenges. Some of them harsher than we face today. Those challenges didn't start with colonialism. There was always challenges, and every generation had to face those challenges, right? And so now, though, it comes to our time, this moment, in this day, that mantle of continuing who we are as Kapompo, as Santa Clara people, as Pueblo people, that mantle is now on our shoulders. Those responsibilities are in our hands. And now we have to give everything that we have to try to seek the continuance of who we are, right? So that one day in the future, those who come after us will say, how come you gave it all away when you had a chance to do something about it? So this is the work that not just myself, but so many others are involved in to continue that story of who we are, so that it might not end at this time, but that we continue to re-engage with those core values and allow them to continue to guide who we are. So with that, I think I went a little bit long, but I'll step for any questions or anything like that. And hopefully for those of you that were here in previous years, it's a little bit different, some new food for thought. So thank you very much for allowing me to join you all today.
I know that was Jaya. Jaya. Come here. Such a
Porter, thank you so much. It's really powerful to trace the history that it's just, actually, it's kind of shocking. But it's really important for us to understand that what is happening among the Rio Grande Pueblo peoples is not a cultural revival. It's actually a cultural continuity. And you are part of that. And Roxanne, and we're just so incredibly grateful to, have you speak that history to us. It's one thing to hear it from, a new Ruth Benedict, so to speak, but it's another to hear it from the heart of someone who has studied, your people, your history so deeply, and also the issues around how we adapt to a future without losing the richness of the cultures that are represented by all of your ancestors. So thank you, really, with all of my heart, for bringing this to us this afternoon. So we will, just FYI, for those of you who are wondering about the schedule, we will not have Zazen at 5:30. We want to just kind of take this rare opportunity, of Porter sharing, the histories as fully as you have. And also, we'll have a little break, and then Roxanne, and we'll just have a pause before dinners. But I don't want us to rush. This is so important, for us to be able to access what your lived experience is, and how we can interface with, these cultures in a way that is respectful and generative and deeply supportive. So if there are questions of Porter, this is yes. Vanda, here you go.
Thank you. Porter, thank you so much. I feel blessed to have heard that summary, and my heart is full. My name is Vanda. I've only lived here 3 years, and my question of you is, how can I be an ally? How can I be respectful to support the ongoing nature of everything that you face? How can I be an ally from a place of respect and not appropriation?
Thank you for that question. There's not a simple answer to that question, I think, but I think that there's a lot of ways that someone can be impactful uh, in different ways, and one is looking at each one of you as voters on one hand, right? Perhaps, right, and looking at how those federal elections have a huge impact on our communities. Depending on who's in government on the state side, doesn't really, actually, strangely enough, has no impact has very little impact. I shouldn't say no, very little impact on tribal communities, but federal elections have great consequence, right? And so paying attention to how those policies on the federal level, and who are those leadership, right, and being thoughtful in how you use your voice in that way. That's one thing. Is that one direct way I would say is that voting impacts our communities in a huge way, right? Another one is looking at how your actions, and being reflecting and spending time reflecting on how your actions might and I'm sure in most cases inadvertently, contribute to the impositions, right? And thinking of reflecting on how each one of you is going to be so different, right? But how um, your own lives and ways you go about it might contribute to the impositions of colonialism, right? And maybe ways that you might not have even thought of before, right? And then, of course, um, I think awareness is important, as well as realizing maybe there's ways that you can help, in there's other opportunities, for promoting language work in communities, promoting cultural revitalization or vitality activities, right? And looking out for those opportunities to support those kind of very important work that usually is not funded very well. And I'll give you a good example, okay? Um, our school is a dual language school, Tewa and English, right? The federal government, true to its style, right, gives us about enough money for language and culture to hire half a person, right? So out of our whole budget that we receive of federal dollars, about we have enough to hire half a person, which is not enough to run a dual language school, right? To have a true dual language program, right? And so we have to continuously seek alternative funds and sources, grants and things of that nature to support half our mission. So I like to always say the federal government only funds half of our mission and leaves us to sort out the rest, right? Of course, we're creative people and we're always finding new ways to solve the problems that face us on a day-to-day basis. But that's a good example of how important, most language work is funded through grants and nonprofits and things of that nature. And so it's really important for people to understand that dynamic. The federal government doesn't give us money for language and culture. In fact, it's just a small amount.
Yes. Thank you so much. My name is Ala, and you just mentioned language, and I have some experience of losing the language of my mother because of Russian occupation of my land. How do you preserve it? And I'm thinking of those kids who are speaking Tewa in your school, but then don't have to use that or have to use English mostly. So how are you thinking of that, and what else you wish you had to preserve the language for long term?
I don't know that we have all the answers, and we have a lot of work to do. But uh, one of the things that got this started in the first place is in 2005, there was a study done of our community, and at that time there was only one school age student that was fluent in the Tewa language, right? And so from that kind of started off the reason to change the direction of the school. Um, and at that time, they found that most fluent speakers were 50 years on up. Um, and that directly correlates to the adoption of HUD housing, right? So you can say if you were born and grew up in the village prior to HUD housing being adopted, there was a very high chance that you were fluent. If you were born after HUD housing and grew up in those homes, then there was a very good chance that you probably weren't fluent, right? And so those things are tied together very closely. But one of the things that has always been true, and it's not special to any kind of language, is that um, that getting young people to speak through immersion type activities, that's that's the that's not it's not rocket science, right? Um, and so that's something that we're focused on and how we might develop. And we're working on a new curriculum for our school that takes us away from the K through 6 model, because we say we have to remember us as human beings, we have been awesome educators from the beginning of time, right? We have always been educators. Schools only represent the last millisecond of human history, right? So they're a brand new concept, and there's no reason to think that that's like the ultimate best way to educate people, because we've already been awesome educators, right? And us as Santa Clara people, we have already had a robust and rigorous system of education for thousands of years, right? And so we have to remember that we have it in us to break away from that system and readopt our model of education. So that's what we're looking at right now, and creating a 4-stage uh, model for learning the language that's based on the growth of a corn plant, right? Which is the language, the words we use for human growth are the same as for corn growth. So we are corn, right? That's how it goes. So as a person is growing into a competent Santa Clara person, right? They're going through the same stages of growth as a corn plant is. Some of us are barely sprouting out of the ground, showing some leaves. Some of us, the leaves are leaning onto the ground and they're crawling, right? Some of us are starting to create corn cobs, right? Maybe others are already ripe, right? And getting the leaves are drying. So talking about all those stages, right? Well, the kids are the same way, right? And so I'm a lifelong learner myself, right? And so all I can do is contribute what I can to transform the systems as much as I can, right? And see what we can do to turn those systems to our benefit, right? And turn some of this around. Right. There's a lot of good examples all around the world, right? So we don't have to necessarily recreate the wheel, but we do have some challenges because we are our government is still our tribal elders and leaders still believe that the language should be oral and not written. Okay, so we're not allowed to write the language, so it has to be taught orally. So that makes us in a different situation than say other languages that are written, right? Because we can't do that. There's no formal system of writing, so it has to be oral. But that's how we've been passing on language in all languages for a really long time, right? So that's how people learn language, and especially when they're young. So it's an ongoing challenge, ongoing work. So
Thank you, Porter. So there's, in addition to those of us in the room, there are about 50 or 60 people online. And I'd like to ask if there are any questions coming from our online community. Any questions of Porter? You can raise your digital hand. Yeah, okay, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Swentzell. My name is Susanna. Since you do work with children and young people, I'm interested in whether or not you're noticing a mood or a movement among them to recenter traditional design and architectural styles, or to recenter, for instance, sort of more common resource economics within the Pueblo. And I'm sure it's very hard when they're attached to computers and the web and they're seeing this global cash economy swirling all around them. What are the kiddos saying about this?
it seems like you're usually working and going up the track that we're choosing to go is like up a side of a mountain in the middle of a blizzard with the snow blowing in your face at 60 miles per hour, right? And you're like, are we ever going to be able to make a movement on this issue, right? And then I'll be walking around our campus, right? And I'll hear the little kids running by me say, mama, say tamu. And that's what they refer to. They don't call like doctor or Mr. or Mrs. They say uncle or aunt, right? Because that's our typical way of addressing people, like the customary approach. So say mama, we'll say tamu, good morning. What happened, me? Where are you going? Nabi oficina pio, me. They'll be having those little kinds, but they're these little people, right? They're all saying these things. And that just fills my heart with joy, like, oh, okay, there is something, and I see my little niece jumping off the bus, saying Tamo man, and I say, okay, we're doing something, right? And we have a lot more work to do, right? And I think one of my dreams also is to re-engage back with that architectural piece as well that I highlighted. And we inherited the government facilities that we run the school within, right? And for various reasons, the choice was made to shift to keep the facility side of things under the control of the Bureau of Indian Affairs instead of under our control. And there's pluses and minuses to that. But I'm seeing a lot of problems with that because then we're beholden to follow their rules. Like you can't build a new building or a new bread oven or anything unless people from the Bureau of Indian Affairs come and say you can build a building there or things like that. Or my favorite thing is they send inspectors every now and then, right? With their clipboard and everything, and they say, we want to check on the status of our buildings, right? And the last time I went around with the guy who's with his clipboard looking everywhere. he was like, I want to see building 741. Okay, we're 763, right? All these very governmental sort of terms for buildings, right? He came up to a building and I was like, how about this building 750 or whatever the number was, right? And he's like, he looked on his list. He's like, that building's been demolished. Building is not demolished, right? I was like, well, it's right here. There's the building. He's like, well, the notes say it's not, doesn't exist, right? You know, and I was like, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. You know, the building is still undemolished. I hope you're not planning to demolish it because that's a classroom area, right? But ultimately, we do need to look at how do we move forward in a way that incorporates Pueblo-based master planning, right? To think about how do we build a school that represents our core values in the architectural way as well, right? For the meantime, we're dealing with people with clipboards that tell us that certain buildings aren't supposed to exist, and they write long, long audits, many pages long, about how a trash can is too close to a fire extinguisher. Anybody that's ever worked with the government, they probably can imagine all the fun things that we get to do with them.
Thank you for putting up with all that, Porter, truly. I just want to be mindful of time. The only thing now I'm thinking about is not zazen, but dinner. And I think we could go on. I just want to thank you so much on behalf of all of our friends here and online. It was illuminating, truly, and disturbing, and also hopeful. That's the thing that I'm carrying away from, your presentation. I feel a lot of hope, and you're carrying that. So our deep gratitude to you, old friend, and heal well. May it be a light case that has, found its way into your organism. And we're grateful that your mother is here, and apparently you only had an 18-second interaction with her over the past few days. So we apologize for spilling the beans about your COVID to your mother, but anyway, nonetheless. So I think what I'd like to invite us to do is to, offer a deep bow to Porter for your immense efforts to keep the continuity in place. So grateful. And I'd like to also invite us to take a 10-minute bio break, stretch, and take care of the body. And then let's come back. So Roxanne, non-virtually in presence, will be in our midst. And again, thank you, Porter. We look forward to seeing you in person more than once a year somehow. Yeah, thank you, dear friend. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Okay.